Ralph Nader is a former US presidential candidate and consumer activist. I spoke with him earlier today and asked him if the Madoff case ends with his guilty plea or whether the government should be doing much more to prevent similar scams.
Well, what the Madoff disaster for so many investors demonstrate is that there wasn't any regulation to speak of. The Securities Exchange Commission allowed this to happen again and again because it claims it didn't know about it, and even though it sent investigators a few years ago and they came back saying everything was okay.
And there were repeated warnings.
Repeated warnings. In fact, the Greek American who exposed it was asked on 60 Minutes recently, how long did it take you to see that something was wrong when you looked over the papers? He said 10 minutes. He said, but it took 4 days to deal with the mathematical equations to prove my case.
So why was it ignored then?
Because the federal cop is asleep on the corporate crime beat. These are regulators that are appointed often from the very industry they're supposed to regulate, and they're going back to the industry after they leave the Securities and Exchange Commission. These state agencies are really relying on the Securities Exchange Commission. In Arabic, it would be called the fawda. In other words, it's an anarchy. So many millions of small investors in this country think the government's protecting them from these corporate criminals and swindlers, and obviously the news reports in the last 8 months have shown that's not the case.
So you say much of it is to do with the lack of regulation as well as corporate greed. How does that need to be addressed? Does this administration looks like it has the right kind of solutions?
Well, no, it hasn't, because it's so busy bailing out these big corporate crooks and failing companies like the Citigroup and AIG, and trying to deal with a collapsing economy that resulted when Wall Street mismanaged, looted, and drained trillions of dollars of savers' money and pension money and mutual fund money, that they really haven't gotten around to the issue of law enforcement. And I say that because they have not asked Congress to expand the Justice Department's prosecutorial capability, for example, investigatorial capability, to toughen the penalties so that these corporate crooks can be prosecuted, convicted, and sent to jail. That's the only language these corporate crooks understand.
But can the government, though, afford to let some of these major financial institutions collapse? Some are saying that the bailouts, in fact, aren't big enough.
Well, they're the wrong kind of bailouts, first of all. I mean, if the government really wants to encourage lending in this country, they'd use $350 billion instead of putting it down a Wall Street rat hole. They'd start 10 banks with a clean balance sheet, which could then, on a 10-to-1 ratio, lend $3.5 trillion. A Stanford professor has suggested this in the Wall Street Journal recently. And then the government can sell off the banks in the coming years. Instead, what they're doing is they are trying to bail out the crooked, mismanaged companies to protect the small investors and the small business and the rest of the economy. But that money never gets there. In fact, now Congress is asking a question of the Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve. Where'd the money go? How was it used? Who benefited from it? That's still not available to the U.S. Congress. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars.
How much is Washington, though, to blame for the kind of problems that the economy has faced, not just in this country, but around the world as a result, because of its own brand of capitalism that many would say amounts to reckless capitalism?
Casino capitalism, we call it. Well, the first responsibility is with the Wall Street people. And the second responsibility, the secondary, is that Washington didn't stop them. It didn't deter them. It didn't punish them. It didn't require disclosure. It didn't require regulation. It didn't require law and order. I mean, historians will look back on this and say, where was the government? The government was basically letting Wall Street do whatever they wanted, and when Wall Street collapsed, the taxpayer picks up the bill.
So would you say the government is mostly to blame for a situation that has really gotten completely out of hand?
Well, in terms of the public trust, of course. But, you know, there is public trust in Wall Street. You know, investors are entitled to these business people performing in a fiduciary, honest way.
But how much trust is there really? How much confidence when Obama has surrounded himself when it comes to his economic team of advisors, with some of the very same people who advocated and advanced some of these policies of deregulation. Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, to name just but two.
That's exactly why we're not going to get fundamental reforms out of this cataclysmic collapse that's reverberating all over the world. Because they have taken the very people who supported deregulation, like Larry Summers in the Clinton Treasury Department, Timothy Geithner, who is head of the Federal Reserve in New York, they're all part of this. And that's why there'll be no fundamental reform. Fundamental reform means, number one, enforcing the laws to prevent this from happening again. And one way you do it is convict the crooks and send them to jail. The
and that's not what's happening. Some people are saying you're actually rewarding some of this corporate recklessness and greed by pumping so much money into these institutions that got the country into this.
That's called moral hazard. In other words, they know they can do it again because they're too big to fail. AIG just had a PowerPoint presentation, which was leaked to the press, and it was 20 pages of clear explanation as to why AIG is too big to fail and how it will bring down the world economy if it is allowed to fail and not be continually bailed out beyond the $180 billion that the government has already poured into this rat trap. So you see, this will happen again, and every time it happens on a bigger scale, unless there are fundamental reforms. And one fundamental reform is to give investors power to control the money that they are investing. Right now, the shareholders have no power.
Who is controlling most of it? Would you say the government is gaining too much control in these institutions because of the money it's giving to them?
Well, they have to, because they have to safeguard the taxpayers' money. The question is the government control just another warmed-up version of the corporate type of control?
So are these quick fixes that are designed essentially to just take the pressure off some of these politicians?
Exactly. They're very quick fixes. They're being stampeded. Quick, make the decision. They're not thought through. And besides, most people don't even know what in the world is going on, including people in Washington. It's so complex, so global, so secret, so intertwined. That's why this AIG memo, which you should report on, is so fascinating, because they go through one area after another, which will collapse all over the world if AIG is not saved by Washington, D.C. So that's right from the horse's mouth.